Hi folks! Today I'm going to show a way of animating that you might have heard of, but I don't think it's widely understood very well. There's kind of an assumption that hand-drawn animation is lively and expressive, while rig animation is flat and dead. While that's semi-true, style and technique are connected, but they're also flexible and blendable. In the world of 2D rig animation, I think the shining example is Hilda. I think that the characters are perfectly designed for rig animation, and it's done brilliantly. But also, it's a comparable style to Gravity Falls, which is hand-drawn. But I don't think that Hilda is lacking anything that Gravity Falls has. Where different styles suit different techniques, I think those shows meet in the middle, where either one could have been done either way without much difference. So here's my own preferred workflow in toonboom. It's basically the same technique that we used on two of the shows that I worked on, and I believe they did pretty much the same thing in the 2020 versions of Looney Tunes and Animaniacs. We're going to use drawing and rigs together to make the rig animation better. Today, we're gonna do a style that strongly suits hand-drawn animation and see how close we can get. We are looking at our reference points now. What I mean when I say juicy is how they use the squash and stretch, breakdowns, textured timing and spacing, and so on, to get this witty and lively style of movement that I find just extremely appealing to watch. And the drawing style is always exaggerating the form and depth. It's making the most out of the principles of animation, squeezing the juice out of each drawing. Most series animation cuts down on these things for the sake of speed and consistency, but personally, I tend to prefer a looser style that makes each moment feel unique over a strict and stiff style, even if it doesn't always go right. Anyway, let's get started. So we have our little scene set up here with Mr. Mouse, Michael Mouse. It's basically a rip-off of a gag from the Mad Doctor. He's followed by a spooky ghost that blows out each torch, and once he gets over to the right, it blows out the candle. We have our layout while the finished background is being worked on, and the rig is just the same one that I already had from a while ago, just with a couple of improvements. Starting out with roughs is the best way to ensure that you get off on the right foot, for any style. Even if you are working within a stiff, reused based style, I think it's still good to even do a super quick gesture pose here and there. It's our chance to load some human brain force into the process from the very foundation. It'll make the animation look more natural, and you'll get poses that you never would have thought of if you just jumped into posing the little pieces. We want the rig to give us what we want, not just accepting what we get by default. I'll just mention some of the things that we can do here to get a more expressive look. We want strong gestures, good lines of action. We want to use the available lines, like the waistline of the shorts, to give a sense of gesture and dimensionality. One thing that always bugs me, whether it's due to a rig limitation, style restriction, or an animator half-assing it, is when everything's locked into a plain 3/4 view and a character can't tilt their head. So to look up and down, they'll just rotate the entire head instead of moving the features. If you can get the characters' heads to look around a bit, it goes such a long way towards improving the animation. If you've ever animated classic style characters before, you'll have noticed that they're really designed to facilitate gesture. I can totally see why the ball and pear character design was standard for such a long time. And the shapes tend to be designed with weight and flow built in. Glenn Keane calls his posing principles rhythm, tilt, and twist. They're properties that you can always check in on if you're finding a pose looks unnatural or stiff. Those things are not in typical TV animation designs, which are made for easily repeatable held poses. But for this style, that's what it's all about, so let's try and get some of that into our roughs. It's just animating traditionally, basically. The drawings don't need to be super refined, and some details can just be skipped, unless there's something subtle that's also important to build in from the start. I'm keeping the rig nearby as a reference, and I also have model sheets open on the other monitor. I still think of things basically in a pose-to-pose kind of way, but my preference is to have a lot of keys and breakdowns. It gives a clear idea of what the animation will look like, and it makes in-betweening easier. For example, if I had a character turning around, I wouldn't just make one key facing this way and one facing this way. I want to figure out that little step that shows how it happened. The breakdowns for this style of animation can be pretty extreme. So long as they flow nicely, they can be more distorted than you might expect. So the key to making those breakdowns work is that it isn't just a weird drawing. The shape distorts in the shape of the movement arc. It's a drawing that helps describe the weight and force of the movement, and the amount of distortion should be proportional to the spacing of the animation too. They used fewer drawings, but Little Witch Academia was really inspiring for how they really juiced the breakdowns with tons of momentum, as well as how they set up contrasts to get lively animation. I really recommend framing through some of those shots. Another great resource is Eric Goldberg's book. Of course, the perfect person to write about this sort of thing. In your keys and breakdowns, one of the most important things is to keep the movement of the biggest masses clear. If those big blocks are flowing well, it not only makes the scene more readable for the viewer, but it also makes the whole process much smoother and easier. I end up spending about 2/3 of my time on making and breakdowns, and then the rest goes pretty quickly. So even though this is a rough stage, don't rush it. It facilitates everything else, so it's worth spending time on. Okay, get your podcasts and playlists ready because this is a long process and it's really mechanical and a bit boring. We take our rough layer and move it above the rig, add a transparency node and lock it. Now, take our rig and piece by piece form the shapes to match our drawings. This is the best part of like 2 days just doing this. One thing that I'm wary of when I do this is that I want to build things in a way that makes in-betweening easier. So where possible, I'd rather avoid flipping parts and just reposition and form them instead. To make that a little clearer, not everybody would do it my way, but say I was posing the nose from one side of the face to the other. You can get it there by flipping the peg. That might make the key stage quicker, but it will take more work at the in-betweening stage. So I would rather just have 3 different drawings that all share the same deformer, which might take longer to key, but it will be easier to in-between. We run into the main limitation at this phase. A rigged character can be animated really nicely when they're simple, but the more detailed the character gets, it takes ages to put all those little bits into a unique pose, and they still might not tween well, so you're more likely to see windmill movement without foreshortening. And if you wanted dynamic animation, you might reach a point where it'd be quicker just to draw it. One of the cool things with a design like this is that the body is really simple. It has just enough detail to describe the posture and no more. And all the detail and contrast is in the hands and face. So the majority of your time is going towards the expressive parts that matter, that people will actually be looking at. Once all the bits are in place, we will turn off our drawing layer and check each pose for errors, broken lines, and so on. I ended up redoing bits here and there that turned out ugly, just by redrawing and then redoing it with the rig. Now, we are over halfway done time-wise. It doesn't look anywhere close to being done, but we're setting a good foundation for the upcoming steps. Now, with our key pass done, we are moving into our first animation pass. We're going to add smaller breakdowns that'll make the animation more lively than if we just in between from A to B. If the previous version had this much information in the movement, this pass will give it this much. If I did have a voice track, I would be basing a lot of my decisions around that. Where to make the spacing wide or narrow, where do I hold back, where do I use a strong movement, and so on. We still want to have some textured timing and spacing here, so not every step is going to be the same speed, or I might want to hang on to this pose for a while before turning off. This is a good phase for working out those sorts of things. We're adding our little anticipations, deciding how poses are going to settle, how weight is shifting. I really like this part of the process for those reasons. One of my quirks that I do all the time, or one of my habits, is that if the body is going up and down, I'll delay how the head goes up and down. So the most tilted head position is happening in the same frame as the biggest spacing of the body's movement. We shouldn't just tween and accept what the computer gives us. Even if it wouldn't do this, we should still adjust things and make the movement how we want it to be. Here's a simple side-by-side. Do we just do a plain A to B? Or do we give it a little flexibility? One thing I'd always say is don't just do squash and stretch from the peg. Make sure and deform the shape and say something about what that object is. The difference from the previous step to this one is like this. There are still in-betweens to do, but it's more fleshed out with roughly twice as many completed frames in the timeline. At this stage, we'll now in-between what we have. Our breakdown pass should make it really easy to picture where all the in-betweens are going to go. If things are not flowing nicely at this stage, I would recommend actually turning back and maybe deleting some breakdowns before moving on to get something simple that works, rather than trying to counteract a big problem with the small movement. I've been caught in that trap myself, and it's a sunk cost fallacy thing. I see it as like we're executing things that we set up earlier. But there are some things we can do while we're at it, filling in the in-betweens, such as offsetting the timing of different body parts so that everything doesn't start and stop at the same time. So you'll often have the body arrive at its settled pose, but maybe the arms and heads take a frame or two longer than that. Don't be afraid to make small changes to keys at this point too, if it helps the overall motion. Keep an eye on the arcs, fix the rig where it breaks, get that overall movement working. It's okay now, but let's make it a little nicer. The examples that I was using for reference supplement the big squashes and stretches, smaller ones, face. This one in Runaway Brain is a nice clear example. He doesn't just look up towards his ear. The way that the eyes stretch up, leading with this one, gives a really great sense of intent to the character that you wouldn't get with just a basic pose-to-pose type. So let's add some of those. If it fits within the overall movement, You probably won't have to fiddle with it for too long, and if it is taking too long or if it doesn't work out, we can always just go back to our previous version. And we're adding overlapping movement to the hair, clothes, etc. In this case, it's the ears and tail. We already built this into our breakdowns, but we can make it better. I tend to just go straight ahead and eyeball it because I'm doing a movement that's reacting to the main movement. I'll also give his nose a little more bounce and like that. This is the stage where if you wanted to add little things like maybe his foot slaps the ground, squashes a bit, it's a good time to do that now. Okay, we're on the home stretch now. If I had dialogue, I'd finally do the lip sync now, because now I know the head isn't going to change. I just have a couple of mouth shapes to add in-betweens for here. I'll add some in-between drawings for the hands now. Sometimes you can ease just by copying and editing a hand drawing, make the fingers flop or whatever. Sometimes it's just as quick to draw one from scratch. But anyway, they're an expressive part, so having a lot of unique hands goes a really long way to getting the hand-drawn look. And especially on a character like this, there's a lot of color contrast, so people are going to be looking at them. It's also the sort of thing that's easier to just draw new hands as you need them than it would be to make a rig hand with multiple layered parts. If you're ever watching something and you're not sure if it's rig animation, just look at the hands, whether the hands are changing a lot or if they're staying the same for many frames. After this, we want to render it and skip through each frame to check for errors. Some errors might not be apparent in working OpenGL view, so it's worth the rendering time to check. I'll write down a little to-do list of things to fix, and then we're done. The highlights were a whole different process, but it's basically like my other shadow tutorial, except it was quicker and easier this time because the shapes can follow the movement from the existing pegs and they can be cut by the existing drawings. So to summarize the steps here, we're using drawing at the start of the animation process to make stronger poses. We get a more organic and flexible look by utilizing gesture. We're pushing the rigs beyond what comes as default. In the middle of the process, we're using strong breakdowns to get more force and flow into our movement. Then we're adding another pass of small breakdowns to make it lively. After in-betweening the overall movement, we have another pass adding smaller movement. And then, towards the end of the process, we're adding more unique drawings to face and hands. I think there's still a lot to explore with techniques like this, mixing hand-drawn animation and rig animation different ways. I've been trying out a variety of ways in my short that I've been doing at home. In this one, the character is hand-drawn up until a certain point, then this point, he swaps over to the rig. And in this one, the more busy character is hand-drawn and the more static one done with the rig. So if you have animators who can do both, not only can you choose which scenes to do one way or the other, but you can also make your rig animation a little closer to the hand-drawn look. Now, don't get me wrong, I am for sure not pitching this as a replacement for hand-drawn animation. There are many things that cannot be done any other way, and the truly great hand-drawn stuff just cannot be faked. Putting the clips side by side, the rig animation is still held back a little bit, right? Because drawing is such a direct way of controlling every little bit of the character. The human brain force is directly in the work, in every line of it, and that's what gives it life, that's what makes it captivating to look at.
when it's done well, every part of the image is thought about and cared for. It's a lot of work and it might have mistakes, but that also means that every little thing can be done creatively, and just by the nature of it, the more that you automate that or otherwise restrict artists from being able to put in that creativity and care, well, the result can become kind of dead, flat, stock, default, generated, bland and boring. Whatever the technique. I mean, come on, give me some incentive to look at the screen, for Pete's sake. Oh, what, am I gonna miss 1 of 3 recycled expressions? Whatever, it's not like I'm missing any insight into the character's thoughts.
So primarily, I'm pitching it as a way to improve rig animation, or maybe a replacement for the really bottom tier hand-drawn animation. You've probably seen hand-drawn stuff that was so limited, it might as well have just been rigs. The benefit is also dependent on the complexity. If you have a super dynamic shot where the character is changing angle and pose a lot, you might be better off just doing it hand-drawn than going through the bottleneck of making tons of poses with the rig. And like I mentioned earlier, a simple character design works best. If you have a lot of proper clothes, anatomy, hair, it doesn't suit the rig process well. The pro is of course the speed, especially as you're mostly skipping cleanup and color, and one person does the whole process. On a hand-drawn movie, each animator is doing maybe 4 seconds per week, and then someone has to spend much time or more again cleaning it up, and after that it still has to go to digital ink and paint. On a rig series, animators are typically doing like 20 to 40 seconds per week, so this technique is somewhere in the middle of those. Another thing to factor in is the length of the animation. On a series, when you're doing hours of animation with the same characters, it's worth investing in a skilled rigging department. On a 30-second advert, that rigging phase is still going to take the same effort, but is going to take a bigger proportion of the overall time and budget, which might be better spent just hand drawing it. If anyone out there has mixed up these techniques in more ways, I'd love to see it. It seems like a handful of shows work this way, but it's still relatively fresh to know. Thanks for taking the time to watch.
Thank you very much, Lynn, for helping with the layout. And as we always say, no rules, just tools.
Remember, it's you, the maker, who makes things good. It comes from here. Okay, see ya.